Today I want to talk about 5 Christian urban legends. This was prompted by a conversation I had with my kids on Halloween last week, and I know I already did my Halloween video. If you missed that, check that one out for me. And don't worry, only one of these 5 relates to Halloween. But the reason that it came up is because my mother gave a rather negative comment to my children about trick-or-treating, and luckily my kids, as they are getting a bit older, have seen that grandma thinks very differently than myself or even my wife. And so almost in humor, they asked about it, and then we got into stories about my childhood where I told them about a particular Halloween where my aunt was in town, and while my mom was gone at a prayer event, she snuck us out and took us trick-or-treating. The fear, the guilt, and the shame I had that night outweighed any candy that I may or may not have gotten. So I relayed this story to my kids, and it got me thinking about that night trick-or-treating, something I hadn't thought about in a long time. And that's our first one. The first urban legend is that Halloween is the devil's holiday. Now, this is related to the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s when I was a child. And though less common in Christian circles today, I still know many Christian families that do not participate in this holiday in any fashion. Now, as I always cover, I'm aware that in sharing these personal stories with you, it gives many Christians the ammo to say, see, you were in that crazy fundamentalist cult. Sure, yeah, growing up, I still had decades in Christianity where that was not the case. But I think it can be cathartic to look back on the things that many of us grew up with and just say, look at the insanity. So, the legend, and I'm sure there's many iterations of this, going back to Halloween being the devil's holiday, is that this was a night of the year where the devil could really get a foothold. That on this night, all the evil people of the world would be trying to lure children to the dark side. Halloween was no longer about candy and fun and costumes. It was a gateway to the demonic. Stories circulated about Halloween being used to recruit young people to the occult, to satanic worship, to performing rituals. Some went as far as to say that there was human sacrifice on this night, or definitely animal sacrifice. We were very realistically told not to let our dog out on Halloween. At the very least, children would be exposed to evil symbols, and by dressing up would thus be participating in this occult practice, and again, opening their heart to the devil himself. And this fear was fueled by little anecdotal stories, sometimes that weren't true at all, and other times that were highly exaggerated. Many of us will remember the razors being put into the apples, poisoned treats, drug-induced via syringes right into the Reese's underneath the wrapper. Nothing was safe. You might as well not go in the first place, or if somehow you got some candy handed to you, throw it out. Evangelical leaders seized stories like this. Again, even the completely fabricated ones, passed them around, used it as an excuse to show that what they had been warning about was coming true, and at a new record high, further evidence of the demonic presence that had taken over other parts of the past and now was being resurrected on this night of the dead. It only caused a further divide between believer and non-believer. It only showed children like myself that anything, even if it's cultural or historical, if not in the right Christian understanding, was simply a tool of the devil. But I want to move on to 4 other ones, and 3 of these had real impacts on young Brandon in terms of helping me believe or boosting up my faith. And the next one I remember thinking was especially amazing, and this is the urban legend of the missing day in space. Here's how it goes. It's claimed that NASA scientists, while studying astronomical calculations to determine the precise movement of stars and planets and the like, came up with a problem in all of their math. It seemed like a full day, an exact 24 hours, was missing from history. Now, there's kind of 2 versions of this, but essentially both are the same, where the answer is found when the one Christian scientist, because that's not very common, said, hey guys, you know what? In my Bible, it talks about times when the sun stood still, like in Joshua 10, which, by the way, hilarious, no one ever talked about what was going on. God supposedly stopped the sun and the moon from moving so that Israel could continue to fight the battle that God was giving them. It was simply to allow the genocide he was commanding to continue on longer. And again, in that second version, sometimes people tie it into the story of Hezekiah, where God moves the shadow backwards as a sign because Joshua didn't quite get you there. But if you add that plus this, and also if you talk about maybe something that happened when Jesus died, like, yeah, we can get to 24 hours. Those details don't really matter. What's important is, hey, in the Bible, there's missing time because of what God did in the sky, which we can still see today. Isn't that amazing? All the other scientists become believers. There's no other way to explain this whatsoever. And guess what? NASA has now confirmed the Bible is true. And everybody clapped and cheered. Now, anecdotally, I will tell you, I loved the story, and it's so embarrassing, but I was so uneducated. And I don't remember when I heard it. I don't have a particular memory, but I do remember loving it. I remember sharing it. Because again, as a young, indoctrinated boy in evangelical circles, going to a private school that was purposefully limiting actual scientific and historic information, while at the same time from the pulpit, science is slammed as something that the devil uses to trick Christians into doubting. But hey, here's this one instance where, look, there's no other way to explain this. And if it's good enough for all the scientists at NASA, it better be good enough for me. And it worked. And it worked on a lot of other people. And by worked, I don't mean that it made me believe. That's never what this is about. It's also never about converting people. This is the same thing most apologetics about, which is keeping people that already believe, believing longer and stronger. That's it. You're preaching to the choir at the highest level, and it is extremely effective. This one started a bit earlier than the Satanic Panic. It really started in the 60s, a lot of traction in the 70s and 80s with pamphlets and books and sermons. Then with the rise of the internet, it kind of takes on a new life. It starts getting in all of those prayer chains. Remember those? All the Christian emails that were forwarded around, these amazing stories. That's where a lot of this came from or got a resurgence. You know, one that I'm not going to talk about, of course, is all the different times that Noah's Ark has been found. But it's those same circles sending those same stupid websites or PDFs or documents. And man, not only do you see it then, but your pastor got it too. And now he's heard the sermon that the mega pastor did on the TV, and he's giving his version of it. And it all seems to co-align into this amazing new discovery, even if it's 30 years old and has been debunked 1,000 times. Not to you, not to your church. And even if you have heard about the debunking, that's just the devil. So this one is especially hard-hitting because, again, it's using science, the very thing that Christians should be weary of, but of course not when it's actually proving their Bible right. But what is the truth of this claim, this legend? First, there's never been any documentation from NASA itself on a missing day, according to their calculations. No credible NASA statement or publication or interview or research paper supports this claim in any way or fashion whatsoever. In fact, the opposite, we have NASA astronomers that have come out and clearly said that was a lie. That's not true, publicly denying such a discovery. But of course, we can't trust them. So where did the story come from? Well, the origin story is a bit murky, and it seems that there were fictional accounts of this even before it was attached to NASA. The funniest part is that according to the scientific research on this, you can't even calculate retroactively a missing day. We can do a lot of amazing things looking backwards and projecting the future based off observations that can be made, based off evidence that can be repeated and peer-reviewed, etc. But this missing day idea just isn't even there, especially to the level of accuracy that the legend implies. Also, even if something like this did show its head, the idea that NASA would just turn to the Bible and say, oh, look, this explains it, as opposed to continuing to research or leaving open all of the other variables that could cause this. It's so funny. It's such Christian thinking to immediately fill a gap of knowledge, that uncomfortable I don't know, with the Bible says this. That's not how real science works. And I don't know is just fine. Again, not that we have this problem in actuality anyways. Now, I've covered this next one before, but I couldn't leave it out because it scarred my childhood so much. And this is the legend of the Soviet drillers finding hell, and the audio recording that you can listen to right now. We did this field trip to what could only be compared to some kind of Answers in Genesis museum and talk, where the preacher was going on about the inaccuracies with dinosaurs that we had been told, what science was doing to lie to us, secret investigations into the heart of the Congo where they could still hear dinosaurs today. Of course, their equipment was always destroyed. And then the story of the well to hell, where we are all on the edge of our seat hearing about this for the first time, where these Russian drillers dug further down into the earth earth than had ever been before, only to, for some reason, after I guess hearing strange screams, lower a microphone all the way down this borehole, as well as temperature sensors, so important to the story, and were horrified to hear what was clearly human screams. Oh, and the temperatures they recorded were around 2,000 degrees, proving the fiery nature of hell. Then, of course, they flooded us with all of these verses that would allude to hell being in the center of the earth in the first place. If you got a fun version of the story like I did, you heard that these Russian drillers, or sometimes they were scientists, went mad from hearing the sheer insanity and terror of what they discovered. Oh, and just as further supernatural power, one of them, I think, became possessed and could not get the visions out of his head, and maybe even went as far as to kill himself because of being tormented by a demon even after the fact. Like any good urban legend, there's many versions of it, and they all take on a life of their own. Seemingly, though, I was lucky enough to always hear the worst version of every single one of them. Now, there's so many implications with this one. I mean, for one, you have, hey, look, when you take your science too far, learning to drill this deep down, you risk literally coming face to face with hell. Also, of course, putting the Soviet Union as this atheistic, horrendous thing caused by atheism. Of course, they're the ones that have this encounter, right? You can just tie it into anything that you want. But obviously, its main use is the same use as hell. Fear, because it's a wonderful tactic. It is an incredible motivator. And when the stories just aren't cutting it anymore, let's get proof. And so regardless of how true this might have been, even to the ears of the believers, they could use it. And use it they did. Again, it spread like wildfire. How do we know it's not true? Well, because we can track it back to its first appearance in a Finnish tabloid. Then it spreads to a Christian newsletter from the Trinity Broadcast Network, who reported it, by the way, as fact. There's zero evidence for this. We do also know that, yes, there was indeed Soviet drilling. The Kola super deep borehole is the one that is usually tied to this story, which reached a depth of 7.5 miles. So we do know some facts here. And again, within that Kola team, we have absolutely no records or reports of this event happening. We actually have the records of temperature, and it was not 2,000 degrees. That is such a far exaggeration of the heat that was reached 7.5 miles in, as what was recorded was closer to 365, which, by the way, is what you would expect of the geothermal level at that depth. Again, geologists and engineers from that Kola experiment have publicly said there's no truth whatsoever to this. This was a scientific experiment to understand better about the Earth's crust and nothing more. So all I see this is an insane irresponsibility of all the Christian churches and pastors and news radio and reports that pass this around just because it served their agenda with absolutely no scrutiny whatsoever. And of course, this happens with everything. This is how you get urban legends in general. But there's a huge difference when you claim to have the one true religion of the world with the biggest, truly the worst possible sentence for not believing or getting it right, and now you are using that sentence, a life that can never end in the burning depths of hell, eternal torment, as proof of not only your religion, but what will happen to everyone who doesn't believe in it. How very disgusting, especially when put into programs aimed at children. This fourth one, though, is the weight of the soul. It's amazing that after so many years and so much debunking that went on, Christian circles still held on to this as a way to prove that indeed the body did have a soul. This would have been huge if true, and because of which it was easily and quickly debunked. And yet, again, Christians didn't care. It served their purpose. So what is the story? Well, this 21 grams legend, as it is sometimes called, claims that Dr. Duncan McDougall, a physician in Massachusetts, weighed the human body right before death and then immediately after, only to find what? That afterwards, consistently, 21 grams mysteriously went missing. Thus, the soul is real, and we even know its weight, 21 grams. Like I said, this one's much older. The original paper is from 1907, published from the Journal of the American Society for Physical Research, and later in American Medicine itself. And though it definitely made its rounds back in the day, it kind of got a resurgence with the internet, and then in 2003 there was a movie called 21 Grams that is referencing this, and it's been in not just Christian circles, but spiritual circles ever since. Again, this is evidence for anyone that wants to believe that something happens after death. There's a few reasons we know this isn't true, one of which being repeatable studies that did not get at all similar results. But even if we look at McDougall's studies in and of themselves, the sample size is way too small, only 6 6 people. It never came out to exactly 21. That was the average among all 6. One of which, by the way, after losing some, gained some back when tested again later. That part never makes the story. What happened? Did God reject the soul and it came back into the body? So again, bad testing, inconsistent results that spoke to the opposite that were purposely rejected from the conclusion. Unknown variables accounted for. We know the body does a lot of things at death with both liquids and gases. Were those being included for? From the paper itself, it doesn't seem like it was. Also, trying to measure a patient right at that moment before death has its own ethical issues, but also its own practical issues. These people were very frail and moving around, getting an exact, precise reading on the scale that then you compare with a completely still corpse. This is just not a steady way to take this kind of very small change seriously. So let's move on to our final one, which I'm sure almost everyone listening to this will be familiar with, but I think that it is just so representative of all of the main points that I'm even trying to bring up in covering these other stories. And that is the story of Cassie Bernal from the Columbine shootings, or you might also know it as the She Said Yes story. As the story goes, in 1999, when the Columbine shootings, which I think all of you are probably familiar with, so I won't go into detail, but if you haven't read this book, it is unbelievably interesting and fascinating, and he does an excellent job of covering this particular point and how it was used and abused by Christian leaders at that time. But Cassie Bernal is a 17-year-old who supposedly was asked by one of the gunmen, "Do you believe in God?" which she answered yes, and then he immediately executed her. The story portrays Cassie as a symbol of unwavering faith, a modern martyr. But it did more than just prop up the innocence and bravery of Christianity. It also demonized what, of course, we would all agree were the horrendous acts by the shooters, but now they had the motivation of what? Hating Christians, meaning they were probably working for the devil, they were possessed, they were evil, they attended one too many trick-or-treats apparently. It no longer becomes about the fact that they had access to the firearms or their mental health or all the signs that were missed or the things that actually need to be looked at to help prevent these issues in the future. It's just two evil kids. What an oversimplification for Christians to be able to blame this event on. But the story spread rapidly. I heard about it at church, at my Christian school, and in my small group all in the same week. I remember being very affected by this. Again, I was the kid who had his mother reading the stories of the martyrs as his bedtime stories. Also, being in school at this time, it spoke additionally heavy to me. I was a student. This happened to a student. Would I have what it takes? Would I be willing to die for what I believe? Tons of merchandise goes out, the t-shirts, the pins, the buttons, the patches that said, "She Said Yes." It became this movement to stand up for Christianity among an increasingly secular culture. Her mom even writes the memoir, "She Said Yes, The Unlikely Martyrdom of Cassie Bernal." The problem is, it didn't happen. As much as Christians would have loved for it to happen, because it proved everything they've ever said, preached, and ultimately desired, even biblically speaking, which is persecution, being targeted and oppressed for your beliefs. Jesus tells you you will be. So when life is too cushy and Christians essentially rule the world, anytime you can get your hands on some evidence or proof that your kind is actually being oppressed, if not murdered for their beliefs, you're going to jump on that and defend it even once found out that it's no longer true. So how do we know it's not true? Well, we had some misidentification of evidence. It does seem like one of the shooters did ask that question, though it wasn't the only question he was asking, and he didn't ask it to each individual that he shot. And the person it was asked to lived. That doesn't make for a very good story, though. Valine Schur is the name of the student who actually got this question. Witnesses corroborated this account, while none would confirm that this was addressed to Cassie, even though there were people there to witness Cassie's end. There were some unreliable early accounts, of course. You know, this is one of the things Christians love to point to the most when they defend the Gospels being so inconsistent with one another. They'll always use that example about, well, you know, when people witness a car crash or something traumatic and unexpected, you're going to get people saying different things. Yeah. Like with this. Bummer when it works against you. And even though these errors were fixed really quickly, the story had already taken off and it was simply too late. Once again, Christians caring way less about facts and more about we have a good narrative, let's run with it. How sad that this tragic thing became a talking point. How sad that Cassie's death couldn't be sad because a 17-year-old lost their life. That we couldn't just mourn her. We had to use her incorrectly for the agenda. Again, going back through police reports and other witness testimonies, theories and all the corroboration that was done after the fact, not only did Cassie die without this question being asked, she died seemingly without speaking to the shooters at all. Just a random, tragic killing of her that had nothing to do with her belief. And it doesn't matter who was hiding where she was hiding, they too would have died. But again, that story's not useful. That story doesn't sell books. It doesn't get people in pews. It doesn't inspire people to rise up and stand up against the secular tide that is coming for you, Christians. It's just sad, but not in the right way. And that, I think, is what so many of the Christian urban legends have. A lack of concern for truth, a cherry picking of facts, an eagerness to spread a story simply because it is beneficial or useful for you before knowing its effects or the implications, a lack of concern for the implications of said story, the psychological harm and turmoil that these kinds of stories did for so many people, the suppression of real science and the demonization of anything that doesn't agree with you. These stories work, and they are crafted and curated and adopted and spread for a reason. And that reason is anything but truth, which is so ironic as that is supposedly the Christian message. So yes, it's fun to go through these stories and talk about how crazy things were in the 70s and 80s and early 90s and 2000s once the internet brought some of them back around, and how silly we all were for believing them. But it's not like they're done. It's not like they've stopped. It's not like they're not replaced. It's not like they're not still happening, still causing harm and misinformation and distrust. So we should see this as a warning. We should learn from these times where we were so gullible. We should expect more from the Christians around us and the Christian communities and leaders to share only what is true, which I laugh as I say because every week they get up and preach things that are demonstrably false. But until they can wake up to that reality, maybe we can at least help encourage staying grounded factually in the non-biblical stories that they share. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. We're going to be talking about something kind of similar on Tuesday when we look at how Christians portray the difference of the individual once they become saved. Again, bringing up the Christian, demonizing the non-believer. Until then, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.